You are listening to the Love and Confidence Podcast, episode number 116. Welcome to the Love and Confidence Podcast. If you're a woman who wants to feel more irresistible, have more fun, and create deeper and more authentic connections, this podcast is for you. I am your host, certified life coach Lærke Nielsen, and I help you become the best and most confident version of yourself so you can attract the love life you desire. Let's get started. Hey there, welcome to the podcast. Today I have a special guest that I've invited to talk about a topic that is relevant for everything you do in life, not only dating and relationships, but simply everything. I am talking to Dawn Ledet, who is a certified life coach that specializes in self-trust. And Dawn is a seasoned life and business coach, and she is the host of the Self-Trust Solution podcast. And she's also the author of Master Your Inner Dialogue, which is a book that you can get on Amazon. And you can find the link to all this in the show notes. I'm going to put the link to her podcast and her website, where you also can find her book. In this episode, we talk about what it means to have unshakable self-trust and to decide to set a goal and achieve it, and what it means to listen to your intuition or your inner voice. Everything we talk about is applicable to dating and is applicable to the rest of your life because self-trust is so basic for how we live our life and the decisions we make and to what degree we follow through on the decisions. So, I hope you'll enjoy this conversation. So, welcome to the podcast, Dawn. I am so happy you could be with us today, and you are the self-trust coach. So, maybe you want to start by telling a little bit about what that means. Who do you help, and what do you help them do?
Yes, I'm so excited to be here and share with your audience and have this conversation with you, Laird. So yes, I am known as the self-trust coach. And like many people who focus on a particular trait, like confidence or self-trust, it often is born out of noticing a lack of it in yourself or a need for it or a desire for it. And I had a wake-up call about 6 years ago after being an executive in the hospitality industry for a couple of decades. I decided I was going to force myself to walk to work 2 miles to and from work every day. And I sold my car to do this. And I thought I was brilliant. I'm like, okay, I can force myself to work normal hours and to move my body.
Hmm.
And on one of those walks where I was feeling really proud of myself, I realized something's wrong here. Shouldn't have to force myself, trick myself to do something that I want to do. And that was when all of a sudden I recognized a lifetime of decisions and indecisions and actions and inactions that reflected a lack of self-trust. And that is when I got started moving towards it. And the culmination of doing that work on myself, it changed everything. And I knew I had to help other people. And so that is when I became a certified life coach and really focused on bringing forward self-trust. What I work with often is business women and entrepreneurs, but I have helped hundreds of people in various places of either business or even, stay-at-home moms, because it's in all of us. We all have this trust and we all have the ability to grow it because it is silently eroded throughout our lives. When you think about as simple as when you're at school and you have to go to the bathroom and you're told that you have to wait. You're like, wait, okay, maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I can't trust what I'm thinking or feeling. Or you go out to eat and you're telling your friend how much you like this dish and they're like, oh, that's so gross. And then you start questioning, wait, maybe I shouldn't like that. Or
Mm.
you date a person
Mm.
and you say, how amazing he is. And they're like, oh gosh, I would never date him. And you start questioning yourself.
Yeah.
It's not intentional, but that's the ways it can show up. And so when I started doing this work to help people, I really noticed the power of not believing you can trust yourself, which we'll talk about a little bit more, and in building and growing it so that you can make decisions for yourself, so that you can follow through on the decisions that you make, and so that you can have your own back moving forward.
And this is so interesting because I think a lot of people don't actually think about self-trust as something you can grow and something you can work on intentionally. They probably think that either you have it or you don't. I am someone who can be trusted. Or they say, I can never trust myself, for instance. But you work with the clients to actually decide to grow their self-trust and work on that as a project intentionally. And what is the impact you see when they become this self-trusting person? They really feel that they can lean back on themselves and they know they will always do what they decide to do. Maybe not always, but because no one is perfect, but much more than before. What is the difference you see in someone when they grow this solid self-trust?
The biggest difference is in being on their own side, which reflects in all the symptoms that we hear out there where people complain about, I'm a procrastinator, or I'm a perfectionist, or I'm a people pleaser, or even I can't trust myself. Those are symptoms of a lack of self-trust. And so while to your beautiful point, while we still may not always do what we say, we are more interested in why. What's happening? I'm more likely to believe there's a good reason why I chose not to. I'm not looking at it as a way to discriminate against myself or to beat myself up. I'm looking at it as a chance to connect. What do I get to learn from this? And so I focus on it with my clients on what I call the 3 skills it takes to achieve anything. And it's true in any kind of goal, from relationship goals to weight goals to financial goals to career goals. And it's, I'm going to say it, and it's always the simplest thing, but there's so much, it's profound in its simplicity. It only takes 3 things to achieve anything, and that is to make decisions, follow through, and have your own back. And why I focus on those 3 things when it comes to self-trust is because it illuminates the gaps in our self-trust when we do those 3 things. And it's also the way we can build it and see how we're moving in that direction. So the effect of building self-trust is that you don't end up second guessing every decision. You don't belabor every decision. You don't wait and you don't require someone else to tell you whether your decision is right or not. When it comes to follow through, you do follow through. And when you don't, it's because there was just some evaluation. You made the decision to take the steps that you were going to take. And the reason you didn't might be because of new information you have. You don't make yourself wrong for that. You learn from it and make a plan forward. In the having your own back, you're not taking the consequences or the results of that follow through or not follow through, those decisions. You're not taking them and using them to beat up on yourself. You're taking them for the data that they provide so that you can connect to yourself and learn the best way for you to make the very next best decision.
Yes, yes. This reminds me of something I also say sometimes is playing on the same team as yourself, not playing against yourself, always being on the same side as yourself, because I think it's a decision to make, right? That we stop beating ourselves up and instead become curious about what happened there. But I'm curious to hear because When we talk about trusting other people, for instance, we meet a man and we need to find out, is this someone I can trust? Usually it takes a bit of time to build that trust. And I imagine it's the same with self-trust. Like if you decide to commit to this process where you make a decision, you follow through, you have your own back, how much time does it normally take to get to the stage where now I know I can trust myself? I really built my self-trust. Do you have like, is it a number of days or month or weeks or what are we talking about?
Well, I mean, it really is a practice. So it's like yoga, if you will. There's not an end point.
Mm-mm.
Now, the moment that you decide that you trust yourself, no matter what, and like you say, get on your own side, I say we operate from a lens of all of me is for me. That's the lens I recommend people take on. And the more that we start to see that, because you will notice in your own inner dialogue that generally you are either working from a lens of separation from self, like you believe there's a friction of wants within yourself. I want something, but I don't do it. I want something, but I can't have it. When you have that friction, that causes more of those indecisions and second guessing. And so when we create a united front where all of me is for me, even when a negative thought comes up, or even when I'm kind of second guessing a decision, I'm more likely to tune in and get curious. Like, what do I need right now? What's happening that's keeping me from that? So it takes time to shift that lens. It just takes practice. It's an ongoing practice. But once you start it and you're on the lookout for whether you're operating from that lens of connection or separation, then it's so much easier to connect to in those moments you can. And we work through with tools and practices that are available real easy in the moment to bring you back to that connection. And eventually it becomes your operating system. Doesn't mean you never have doubt, but it does become, I call it the operating system. Like that is where you're operating from. You are operating from a level of self-trust that is unshakable, even though there's doubt and challenges. Yeah.
That sounds quite amazing, I think, to have unshakable self-trust. And I was also wondering about, because you help people achieve goals, and we could imagine that finding love is a goal, so to speak, and that we decide, okay, I'm going to find love. But what I hear very often from my clients is that they don't really trust that it will happen. They don't feel certain that they will succeed in achieving that goal. If I came to you and said, I don't trust that I will be able to achieve that goal, what would you say then?
Ooh, I would say that is creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. So unfortunately, when we make blanket statements like that, we live into them. And the truth is, that is what we want to shun, are these labels we place on ourselves. Just like if you call yourself a procrastinist or perfectionist or any of those things, saying I can't trust myself to find love is another label that just shuts down wisdom. It shuts down curiosity, and it keeps you from accessing your actual truth, which is, of course, you can. And that's a much more open place to start. Like, I really invite the listeners now to say, the difference between I can't trust myself to find love versus I'm figuring out how to find love.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a huge difference.
So different. So that's the first step, is to release those labels, release those statements, because our brains are literally wired to take a blanket statement like that and decide it's truth. And then it wants to go and find evidence to support that truth. And so we want to give our brain, because it will find evidence for whatever we give it, we want to give it things that support our goal. So if our goal is to find love, then I want to make statements for my brain to search for evidence that support that goal. And it doesn't
Yes.
have to be rainbows and daisies and making up things you don't believe. In fact, that won't really work. But just not to shut down the possibility. I'm figuring out how to find love.
Yes. I like that phrasing of figuring it out, because of course we might not have the answers to begin with. Am I gonna meet him on Bumble or at some party or whatever, and how I'm gonna do it? You know, you can start out with a strategy and there's a lot of adjustment. And when you learn on the journey, and when I hear you say figuring it out, is a process where you're learning all the time and you're changing your strategy, you're changing your course a little bit to find out and try out different things to see what works for me.
Mm-hmm.
Almost like being an entrepreneur, right? We don't know the answer to begin with, and where we have to put ourselves out there and try different things and see how it works.
Yes. And everything you just said is the essence of self-trust. It's literally saying, hey, that didn't work. And instead of using that as proof it won't work, you're like, oh, I'm so glad that it illuminated this new data.
Yeah.
That's one thing. That one piece of this didn't work. Let me try it this different way.
Yes.
It's so much more supportive. And it's just kinder and a more fun way to be.
Of course, yeah, it's much more fun and much more beneficial because we learn from it. And as you say, we have our own back. And
Mm-hmm.
it's very much the opposite of having this negative self talk where we take it personally when something doesn't work. But I guess that is a difficult step to not take it personally because, you know, with all new things we try, if we don't succeed, some of us might default react in a way as if there's something wrong with me. And this I definitely also see in dating when women go on dates and they don't get the call back or he doesn't respond to their text, and there must be something wrong with me.
Yeah.
And where it's so important to understand, no, no, it's in his head, it's out there, it's nothing you did. And if we take it personally every time, it's very hard and it's very heavy. And the trick is to just see it as you say, as data, collecting data.
Yeah. I mean, it's personal because it's you. So I don't want to dismiss that it doesn't feel great if someone doesn't, align or work out for you. So I think honoring that it doesn't feel good
Hmm.
is normal and
Hmm.
it means that you care. So I think, and that's the difference between what's wrong with me. And I will say, what's wrong with me was one of the statements that always, actually, it still comes up. I just have an answer for it now. And that's what I'd invite the listeners to do.
Hmm.
What's wrong with me, or there must be something wrong with me. If we let that land, again, our brilliant brains love to prove us right. And so it goes and it tries to find an answer or support to show you what's wrong with you. And you will notice it will bring up evidence from the past. It will start predicting the future. It's
Yeah.
really good at it.
Hmm.
And so we just have to learn to answer it. It's one of the first things we do when we start building self-trust is creating a dialogue with that inner voice so that when we hear things like that, we don't let them sink in as if they're facts. We don't live into that truth. We actually just talk to it. Like now, when my brain offers me what's wrong with you, I answer it with everything and nothing, just because that makes me laugh. Now, the truth is, nothing is wrong with any of us.
Mm.
We are humans with human brains. But if you answer it with something that just diffuses it, then it will not go and find the evidence and go dig in and start trying to tell you how terrible you are. So I think one, honor that there's a difference between not feeling good about how something went and deciding that that means something's wrong with you. So that's the first thing, is to separate those two things.
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't have to be anyone's fault. This is the way I like to think of it. Like, it just wasn't a match. And sometimes it's nice when people self-edit themselves instead of me having to edit them out for them.
Hmm. Yeah. 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 And especially when it's early in the process, it's, of course, it's easier to not take it personally, because if you get rejected by someone that only met you once, I mean, they don't know you. And we can see it more like we go into the fitting room, we try a pair of jeans, and it's just not the right size, or the fit is not good. Nothing wrong with the jeans, nothing wrong with me, but it's just not, that's just not my pair of jeans. But of course, the more we invest in something, and the more it can be difficult to experience failure, which in a way, I would say there is no such thing as failure, right? You probably work a lot with that as well, where failure is more learning and data and becoming wiser on what works and what to try next and so on. I'm also curious about, because you talk also about the intuition and how to listen to our intuition and trying to hear that instead of all the noise that also comes up sometimes. The way I understand noise is, of course, what everyone else thinks and what are our negative self-talk. But you said also in the beginning, when someone disagree with you, when you like something and they say, oh, I don't like that, and you start to doubt yourself. And then behind all that noise, there is the intuition or the inner voice. Is that something you work with your clients with as well, trying to really feel, what do I feel and what is my opinion here, regardless of what everyone else has told me?
Sure. And really, the noise that I talk about is, yes, external noise, but also internal noise. So there's this, I picture it, if you will, a lobby, this really noisy, busy lobby. And it's filled with voices from other people, whether they're externally happening or you're just replaying them in your mind. We tend to do that. We tend to like take on what other people will say. So it's filled with that. It's filled with your own doubts and insecurities. The lobby is very busy. It's not all negative, it just has a lot of noise. What experts have said, what your mom has said, what your best friend has said, what you remember doing differently, or how you used to do something that you really liked and you can't do it anymore, or in your mind, right? So that's the lobby. But through the lobby is this door. And on the other side of it is where you really want to be, or you want to spend more time there. And that's your intuition. That's your inner wisdom. It's a quiet voice. So you have to move through the lobby and move into that room. And we have to start making a relationship with that, because we often just stop at the lobby noise and we either live there or we don't want to hear it. So we try and drown out the lobby noise with, podcasts and music and TV and all of these other methods of noise, so that we don't listen to it. And we never end up moving through into our own inner wisdom. And so we want to start practicing that. And it means spending some time in silence.
Okay.
And actively moving through the lobby noise. Really, you can use it as a visual and picture yourself walking through.
Yeah.
And asking yourself some really meaningful questions.
And opening the door and just trying to listen what is in there.
Yes.
So often when I have clients start dating, they have doubts about whether they want to continue dating a man, or they feel that it's a no, but they can't really tell me why. I have a theory that many of them actually have a good instinct, they have a good intuition, but maybe they're not connected to it because they can't explain why. And then when I start asking them questions about what happened on the date, what did he say, and then always something comes up where it's clear that there was a big red flag. And somehow their conscious mind didn't really see it. They just had this intuitive feeling that something is off here. I don't feel like seeing this guy again. And I think that a lot of women have this actually really good instinct or intuition. But when it goes wrong, sometimes it's because we don't listen to it. And
Agreed.
yeah.
Yeah.
Do you experience sometimes also that there is a particular thing with women, the way we are socialized, that we don't trust ourselves as easily as men do, or we somehow have learned that we need to find the answers outside ourselves?
I think more vocal about it. And I think that there's more, I'm going to say noise. I don't mean that offensively by any matter, but there's more talk about it out there. Men have issues with self-trust as well because
Yeah.
they've had the same experiences in some ways. Now, obviously, way different in other ways. I just think it's not as talked about and they are not sharing it as much. And so it can be talked about more as the symptoms with men instead of just it being like, I don't trust myself. But I will also say this, I didn't identify, and many of my clients don't as first recognize self-trust as the root cause. We mostly do see the symptoms. I would have never, if you would have asked me 6 years ago if I trust myself, I would have said absolutely. And I didn't consider myself as even having a negative internal dialogue because it can show up in subtle ways. It's not always the I hate myself, I suck, I'll never do this. It can be much subtler than that. And so I think recognizing it as women, we are more prone to recognize it for what it is.
Yeah.
And it's men are going to notice more of just what they don't do and they just turn it on themselves. Like, I must not be good at that, or I must not be able to.
Okay, yeah, I just had a thought because when I think of, for instance, applying for a job, we always hear that women feel they need to have all the competences to apply for a job, whereas a man, if he only can do half, he's ready to apply. But we can say here, of course, is maybe women feel more comfortable in sharing that they don't feel competent enough or they don't trust that they can do the job. And maybe a man who applies, maybe he has the same feeling, but he just goes ahead anyway. He just applies, even if he has self-doubt.
Well, and
Right?
it makes sense, right? Because oftentimes we try to action, especially men will try and action their way out of a feeling. So if I'm feeling insecure about this job, I'm going to like go and try and prove that I can get it, even though I don't feel good about it.
Yeah.
So it's more action focused, which makes sense to me. And you'll have women that are more action focused as well. But for those that are more in tune with their feelings and not trying to action their way out of it, or their form of action is more to pull back instead of to rush in, that's really the difference.
Yeah, to hesitate a little bit and doubt, can I really do this? And maybe
Well,
ask a
that's
few
it.
people, what do you think? And
That
ask for,
exact statement, that hesitation and that internal dialogue, or even if it's external, is where the break happens. Because that hesitation is when your brain starts to find evidence for why it's a problem, why you shouldn't just move forward. So that's why we have to be able to improve that inner dialogue, because even though that's a perfect example of a subtle way of a lack of self-trust showing up, it's not you saying ugly words to yourself, but it's in that hesitation, and you start feeding the doubt with evidence and with more questions or doubts to fuel it.
yes.
Yeah.
And there's one more thing that I think is really interesting to also look at in perspective of dating and relationships, and that is when we feel that we can't trust ourselves to say no when it would be the right decision to do. Like, for instance, I also hear from some of my clients I have throughout the time that they rather avoid situations where they might have to set a boundary because they don't feel they can trust themselves to say no. So when they are on a date with a man, he asks him, do you want to come home and have a drink at my place, for instance? If they don't feel absolutely certain that they can trust themselves to set the boundaries and say no when this is what they feel, they might be a little bit insecure, and now you are standing in front of someone that maybe you like him or you have a good impression of him, and he wants one thing and you want another thing. So, and that's the conflict, right, where you have to say no to him and yes to yourself. And what I have experienced is when women become really good at setting boundaries or very clear in their mind about what they want and decide ahead of time, I'm not going to do this, however I can do this, so here are my boundaries, and then they repeatedly do that, they can be much more relaxed and present in the moment. So it's almost like self-trust in that context is like having an emotional safety net, right? Or having your own back, you could say also, that I'm not going to allow myself to go into situations where I'm no longer true to myself. And that is also one of the powerful impacts or benefits of building self trust in the context of relationship with others, and not only romantic relationships. It could even be business relationships, right? Where you also sometimes need to set a boundary and decide what am I okay with, and I'm going to trust myself to say no even when it's uncomfortable.
Sure. I mean, you've talked about that, about just being really clear on what you want and what you're willing to do, and then living into that. If we want to go to my 3 simple skills, it's making the decision and then following through on that decision and then having your own back. Now, the piece about having your own back that's important here is if you do end up saying yes when you wanted to say no, is not chastising yourself, is to really learn from yourself. Take it as a really good way to connect to yourself instead of disconnect. Why did I say yes? What if I just changed my mind? What if it doesn't have to be a problem? And if it is, let me just think about it. Why? Because when we think things like, I don't trust myself to say no, it's so dismissive of our power. I'd rather tell myself, and I encourage my clients, your listeners, to do this as well. Instead of saying, I can't trust myself to say no, I would say, sometimes I choose to say yes.
Yeah.
Sometimes I choose to say no, and sometimes I choose to say yes. It's not that I can't trust myself to do it. It's that sometimes I decide differently.
Yes.
And that's okay. What a privilege to be able to decide that I want to say no and then change my mind.
And then also get curious about what happened that made me change my mind. What was it in the situation
Yeah.
where that is also a way of trusting yourself that there was a good reason.
Yeah.
And maybe you haven't really seen it, or there was something like some subtle cues that you picked up on and that made you change your mind.
It means owning your choice. It is so empowering to own your choice when you're not going to judge yourself for it. It's so disempowering to say something like, I can't trust myself, or I, couldn't trust myself, or I didn't do what I said I was going to do. It's like, yeah, and you get to decide that.
It's like when we say I should have done differently, instead of saying, okay, but I did this and I did this for this reason, and maybe next time I'll do differently. So I have a
Yeah.
learning here. Or next time I'll do the same if I feel the reason was good enough, or
Yeah,
I
it
can
might
see
be,
what
I'm
happened.
so glad that I didn't say no like I had planned.
Mm.
Or it might be, oh, this is good. This shows me that I was right.
Mm.
And so let me apply that for the next time. It
Yeah.
becomes a way to connect and to support yourself instead of to disconnect and to punish yourself. Because the last thing we need, especially in dating, is to be in opposition of ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have to connect with ourselves first and create that internal safety so that we can go out and find the partner we want.
Yes. And I think that especially self-trust is so important, because it's almost impossible to trust someone else if we don't have some level of self-trust ourselves. It always begins with ourselves, right?
Totally. And we start to outsource it. If we don't build it within ourselves, we start relying on the other person. And that's where a lot of relationships have challenges, is when I am outsourcing my trust or my decision making to you or my feelings to you. That's when relationships run into challenges.
Yeah. And that's a big topic, and we could talk about for a long time. But I'm sure that the listeners are really curious to get a little bit more information about how to get started, how to actually do some concrete work on building that self-trust. And I know you have a free resource that you offer anyone who's interested.
Absolutely. It's called the 7-day self-trust boost challenge. It's just a simple email series that you get, a little exercise that takes moments every day for 7 days. And you can go and grab that at theselftrustcoach.com and start reconnecting. Because as I said before, it's not that you don't have self-trust. And if you are often saying that to yourself, this is a great exercise to both connect to the self-trust you already have and to start seeing ways to grow it.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. And I'm going to, of course, put the link in the show notes and also the link to your podcast because you also have a podcast which has a lot of value as well. So thank you so much for this conversation. I learned a lot and I think it was super interesting. And I'm sure all the listeners find it very valuable as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on here and speak to everyone.
It's been my honor. Thank you so much.
If you like what you're hearing on this podcast and you want to get support from a coach on your love journey, I invite you to book a free consult call with me. You will find the link in the show notes. And also, don't forget to subscribe, and I would love it if you would rate and review this podcast, and then you'll also help other women find it.